Thank you all for coming, and thanks to all who made this presentation possible. I'm very nervous. It is a new topic to me as well, and I've never presented it before. I would like to start by introducing this wonderful book to you. It is a folklore collection edited by Ukrainian scholar Olena Boryak and me. The book contains Ukrainian obscene folklore collected by prominent Ukrainian ethnographers in the 19th century on request of Fedor Volk, another Ukrainian folklorist, ethnographer, and anthropologist. At that time, in the 19th century, he lived in France. He was in emigration, and he collaborated with a French journal called Cryptadi, who specialized in studying obscene folklore and obscene narratives from a variety of cultures. They collected this folklore, they published in French, and recently we found originals of this text in Ukrainian archives and edited this book. It was supported by a number of institutions, including Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, Antisha in the USA, National Academy of Sciences, and surprisingly, despite of very unusual and sometimes provocative content, in 2019 this book got Ukrainian National Book of the Year Award in nomination Ethnology. Yes, and it is entitled Inventing the Obscene, the Hidden Collection of the Fedor Volk, and then the ethnography of sexuality in the late 19th and early 20th century. So this is where my interest in obscene folklore started. My presentation will last for about 35 minutes, and then I will be grateful for your questions, comments, and general discussion. My research, as I said, my research is at an early stage, and I'm really looking forward to fruitful conversation afterwards. The structure of today's presentation is very simple. First, I'll share some information about peculiarities of early modern songbooks, and from the title of my presentation, which is a hodgepodge of pious and frivolous songs, you may guess what kind of peculiarities I am talking about. After that, I will try to offer a methodological perspective in the frame of which my observations acquire theoretical and political significance. Meanwhile, just let me say that in this research I am working at the intersection of decolonial option, genealogy method, and feminist epistemologies. A few words about early modern songbooks. The 17th and 18th centuries saw clergymen and wandering deacons, wandering deacons, collecting various songs and poetries and creating handwritten songbooks. These songbooks were quite common in the early modern societies of western, central, and eastern parts of Ukraine. Volodymyr Perets, who thoroughly studied these manuscripts, noticed that people valued them very much. Songbooks were bought and sold, and often were quite pricey. In the 19th century, these early modern manuscripts were collected in libraries and archives. However, the vast majority of them were eventually destroyed and lost. In the 19th century, they were not priced anymore, and owners just threw them away. It was not until the end of the 19th century that scholars started paying attention to these manuscripts. Historians, literary critics, linguists, and folklorists gradually became very interested in the manuscripts and treated them as a source of literary and folklore studies. Since the end of the 19th century until now, a large amount of scholarly works about early modern manuscripts has been published. In my research, I am studying the 19th, 20th, and 21st century scholarship that explores the early modern songbooks. For the purpose of my study, I am looking at a particular scholarship, namely the cases when modern scholars encounter songs which they deem appalling, frivolous, erotic, or obscene. All these three epithets are taken from scholarly publications. So just to make it clear, I do not study early modern sources directly and do not give them my interpretation. What I do is studying the modern scholarship about early modern songbooks and looking for cases of semantic clashes. That is when modern thinking gets into conflict with the content of early modern manuscripts. In other words, I study modernity at the background of early modern culture and seek to historicize a sense of allowable and unacceptable in the perception of people from different eras. What is especially interesting in this study, we are not comparing peasants' culture and nobility. We compare the mindsets of literate people, representatives of the intelligentsia from adjacent but different historical eras. And now let me consider one of the cases in more detail. At the very end of the 19th century, Ukrainian historian Mikhail Grushevsky published a paper where he provided a detailed analysis of a manuscript, a handwritten songbook created according to Grushevsky's assessment in the early 18th century. Grushevsky assumed that the collection was assembled by Rusin, quote, a clerical person or at least someone close to a church in Halachina, end of quote. At the outset of the paper, Grushevsky wrote, quote, although in a title of the collection, at the first place, there is a remark about pious songs, and a collection itself is supplemented by a compulsory introductory expression about a help of the Blessed Trinity. From the very beginning, these religious elements are sidelined by secular, humorous, romantic, and frivolous elements. End of quote. And I'll quote it in Ukrainian. Хоч в титулі збірничка на першому місці значиться «Пісні побожні» і споряджається збірничок звичайною побожною фразою про поміч Святої Трійці, одначе спочатку його побожний елемент цілковито усовується на другий план перед елементом світським, гумористичним, романтичним і фрівольним. Кінець цитати. Further, Grushevsky underlined once again that in the songbook we can see quote, a hodgepodge of pious and frivolous, sometimes too loose poetries, songs, and literary compositions. End of quote. Grushevsky believed that a decent person would never put together such adversarial songs whose proximity was apparently offensive. So Grushevsky assumed that an author of the manuscript was not a priest, but, quote, merely a deacon bachelor, дяк бакаляр. This assumption, he continues, This assumption, at least somehow, can help us to explain the presence of big number of frivolous pieces. End of quote. Later in the same paper, he continued very sarcastically. Literate men paid attention to folk songs. However, he often sought only a chance for a mockery of customs of ordinary people, who were separated from the wisdom of this seminarian or a bachelor with a deep abyss. End of quote. And in Ukrainian. Письменний чоловік звертався і до народної словесності. Правда, він часто шукав тут лише матеріалу до глуму над простим обичаєм простого чоловіка, відділеного цілою безодною від мудрості якогось спудея або бакаляра. A decade later, after Hrushevsky published his paper, it was in 1897, scholars started considering the cases of the juxtaposition of pious hymns, psalms, and frivolous, obscene, or erotic songs as typical for songbooks. In 1905, famous historian of literature Volodymyr Perets wrote that, quote, a lower strata of the 18th century Belarusian intelligentsia assembled diverse literary materials, and their handwritten songbooks contained both examples of hagiography and diverse poetry of serious, humorous, and erotic nature. End quote. Soviet Ukrainian scholar Volodymyr Krekoten made the same observation more than 70 years later. He said that among 17th century poetry, quote, one can find a lot of texts of frivolous and overtly erotic nature, end of quote. And third example, a contemporary Ukrainian scholar Leonid Pushkalov, who passed away not long ago and whom I am grateful for supporting this research, indicated, quote, pious and obscene poetry was often placed next to each other in early modern handwritten collections. Another case that I would like to consider here is a unique songbook created supposedly in the middle of the 18th century by Kirsha Danilov. Kirsha Danilov was a factory worker and a singer of tales who spent his late years in the Ural region of Russian Empire. He was a fugitive from Siberia. He fled from katorga. Volodymyr Perets believed that Kirsha Danilov had some connections to Ukrainian culture, but Kirsha Danilov's early years and his background are still unknown. Between the 1730s and 1760s, on the request of factory owner, Kirsha Danilov composed a songbook comprising rare ballads, spiritual and historical, as well as obscene songs. Danilov's choice of songs and the structure of the manuscript, where pious and obscene texts were placed next to each other, puzzled later scholars and publishers. In numerous publications of the songbook in 1804, 1818, 1901, 1958, 1977, and many other editions, song and words recognized as inappropriate were typically either completely omitted or published with abridges, sometimes really seizable. For example, the first scholarly issue edited by Piotr Schaeffer in 1901 contains the fullest version of the majority of manuscript songs, but even here we can find only a few initial lines of the song "Stать почитай, стать сказывать", whereas the rest of the song is completely missing. Konstantin Kalaidovich, an author of an introduction to the publication of Danilov's collection in 1818, stated, Danilov wrote rather for the uneducated people That is why he collected a lot of farces. He sang not for the sake of immortality, but for a satisfaction of his too jolly listeners, neglecting modesty and rules of decorum. In our edition, places marked by dots show that here our singer, oversaturated with gifts of Bacchus and dreams about passionate bacchanals, has completely lost his respect to pudency. End of quote. Now I will sum up briefly reviewed material and proceed to some theoretical speculations. Although the majority of modern scholars considered some content of early modern collections inappropriate and indecent, we should admit that for early modern authors, as well as for the storytellers and their audience, there was no extreme division between decent religious poems and allegedly indecent lewd songs. That means that intelligentsia of the 18th century and intelligentsia of the late 19th century would perceive the same texts differently. This simple idea rests upon the methodological framework of cultural relativism. Volodymyr Hnatiuk articulated its tenets clearly in the review of German Schwanke collected by a 16th century German humanist, Heinrich Bebel. The first edition of the book by Hegel was published in Latin in 1508, and later it was republished several dozen times in Latin and German. Hnatiuk reviewed the latest edition, published in 1907 in Leipzig, and he stated, quote, "Today many readers of these anecdotes would consider them rude and obscene or beyond morality. However, we should not assess them from the perspective of our present. This is not immorality, but something else. After all, the views on morality are not the same everywhere. They are not stable, but changeable together with culture and way of life. In the 16th century, the relations and norms were different. That is why the Bebel's jokes have been read readily in all educated circles." End of quote. And in Ukrainian, this quotation. Читаючи ті анекдоти тепер, не один назве їх грубими і скабрезними, а навіть буде добачати в них неморальність. Одначе їх не можна оцінювати з теперішнього становища. Це не неморальність, але щось інше. Зрештою, погляди на моральність не все і не всюди однакові, та й не все постійні. Вони міняються також із життям і культурою. У XVI столітті були інші відносини, як нині, інші вимоги, тому й анекдоти Бебля читалися залюбки в усіх освічених кругах. Although cultural relativism was an important step in the interpretation of human culture, its achievement is not sufficient anymore. It highlights differences between cultures, but it is unable to see power regimes that transform these differences into hierarchies and naturalized forms of inferiority and superiority. Later on, at the beginning of the 21st century, many scholars from different disciplines started developing a constructionist approach in order to historicize obscenity. They came to the conclusion that obscenity is a modern category which did not exist before modern times. American medievist Michael Camille said that one of the key problems with modern approaches to the obscenity in the medieval art is, quote, our failure to realize that the obscene is in fact a modern category. The word obscene did not exist in, for instance, French until the 16th century, end of quote. Obscenity, therefore, is an invention of modernity. Modernity is a central category for a specific set of knowledge known as decolonial option. This scholarship was elaborated by a pleiad of Latin American and Caribbean scholars such as Aníbal Quijano, Enrique Dussel, Maria Lugones, and Sylvia Winter, among others. My further theorizing relies upon decolonial scholarship to a great extent. One of the key points of decolonial option is an idea that whilst colonialism as a political system has been almost destroyed in the 20th century, coloniality as a global regime continues to define our present. From the works of these scholars, I learned about connections between modernity and coloniality, as well as how race, sexuality, and gender form a crux of the global system of power. In my methodological framework, obscenity is a linguistic and visual phenomenon rooted in the modern idea of sexuality and gender. Obscenity that relies upon the modern idea of sexuality is a new language, modern language, that constructs inferior groups and cultures as opposed to the modern Western idea of civilization. If we go back to the reviewed cases of Baroque songbooks, we may notice that the only explanation of their content proposed by modern scholars typically refers to backwardness, lack of education, the abundance of sexuality, and uncivilizedness. But let me remind you a fact that early modern times was a historical period when Belarusian culture exported to Russian Empire many cultural forms, including music, church singing, and love poetry, quite often based on folk songs. Against the backdrop of such a contradiction, the proposed way of explanation is nothing else than racialization of modern framework. That is not to say that we have to celebrate obscenity. Rather, I am calling for an understanding of obscenity as a discourse that is produced by and productive of the power regime of modernity/coloniality. The contemporary debates about so-called traditional values are a case in point about how colonial legacy keeps us within its discursive power. As many of you probably know, an argument about traditional values is often used in Ukraine to promote conservative legislation and civic initiatives that attack predominantly women's rights and sexual rights. When this happens, liberal intellectuals typically oppose the conservative discourse by means of reference to a traditional culture. They say that traditional culture and traditional societies are not so decent and pure. So to say, you can find here a lot of, in traditional culture, a lot of inappropriate things such as domestic violence, premarital intimacy, rape, and other forms of sexual abuse. My argument seeks to overcome this binary binary opposition between conservative and liberal arguments. The conservative argument is based on a romanticized image of traditional culture created in the time of Romantic nationalism. From the decolonial perspective, this position is produced by colonial discourse. When liberals object to conservatives, their arguments unexpectedly collapse with the same colonial discourse of backwardness and uncivilizedness. This looks like a predicament. My point is that unless we decolonize obscenity and reveal its colonial power, any further theorizing will remain within the trap of colonial thinking. I would like to conclude my presentation rephrasing Boaventura dos Santos, one of the decolonial theorists. In order to produce other narratives and ways of knowing and understanding the world, one has to go beyond the scripts of modernity. And in context of my study, I would add also obscenity, and imagine new ways of theorizing and generating transformative knowledge. Thank you very much.
Any questions for our speaker?
I'm looking to questions, but also,
Somewhere in my library, I have a book of an anthology of bawdy English verse, B-A-W-D-Y. I'm wondering if that term somehow doesn't offer a way out of this binary situation. Bawdy to me means earthy, rude, maybe crude a bit, but it doesn't have the same baggage that the word obscenity has. And I'm wondering if this really isn't a discussion, it shouldn't be a discussion of bawdy verse as recorded in these books rather than obscene verses.
Can you repeat that term, yours?
Bawdy, B-A-W-D-Y. You can ask Google to.
Yes,
From
and
the old word "bawd" for prostitute.
Yeah.
What's that?
From the old word "bawd," which was
Bawd
a word
for
for prostitute.
yeah. But it doesn't seem to have that kind of, obscenity has almost a legal raising.
and bawdy folklore, usually obscene folklore, what I call obscene folklore, it is otherwise translated as bawdy folklore. Yeah, and quite often publications about folklore use this word. But since I was working with Ukrainian language and they use obscenely, so I use this obscene to be closer to the original.
In your anthology, do you have full examples of some of this?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
400 pages. Yeah.
And we have this book in the center
Yes,
here.
actually
Okay,
this copy is from
So I don't have to
the.
do Google incognito and
You can come incognito. We won't.
And the point is probably that the word itself existed in Slavic languages, at least in Ukrainian and Russian. But what happened in the 20th century and late 19th century, the process of obscenization of these words. So they got more rude and unacceptable meaning than it was before. Before that, people used, for example, they sang songs, wedding songs, where a lot of things that we would treat as obscene presented. So they sang these songs. Later in the 19th century, rules became more strict, and therefore the meaning of the words so these words were perceived as unacceptable anymore. This is the way how words acquired these rude and unacceptable meanings, as I see this. But the word itself, they existed since 12th century.
Okay, thank you.
I think yours brought up a good point for the English ear. Our Anglo ear, obscene is really attached to legislation because there are censorship trials and materials rendered obscene or stamps with the word obscene, and like journals in the Soviet Union, I think, that were arrested. The journals were arrested, not the authors.
Yeah.
Same things have happened in the West, but I think this word obscene has like some legal connotation. It might be interesting.
I see.
It might be interesting to look into the translation and see
Yeah.
if there's some similarities there in the etymology or.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yaroslav and then.
You looking at Russian Empire and how basically modernity and colonization is used there. Do you notice any peculiarities about Russian Empire in comparison, for example, with Western countries? Because I'm kind of thinking about Russian Empire and colonization. Like Atkins' book comes to my mind about kind of self-colonization. Do you use that concept, or are you kind of thinking in other way, trying to contextualize modernity and colonization in Russian Empire?
Thank you. Yes, this is important and complex theoretical issue. How can we treat, how can we perceive colonialism from the East and from the West? In my case, what I do, I keep in mind that Ukrainian culture was not enough modernized for the West countries, and Молодший брат, younger brother for Russian Empire. So we play the same role of something that is not developed enough, not modern enough, not progressive enough for all kind of empires and perspectives. So this place where, this is what I keep in mind when I work with this concept, but probably I should, I don't know, create more complex picture of this. Yes.
So first I'd like to comment on the terminological issue. I think your paper is using a term which was used in the past, and that's a piece of intellectual history. And we're not in the business of changing the terminology, right? Because we accept these kinds of things as interesting reading without necessarily having to define it as obscene or bawdy or anything like that. Furthermore, changing the name to a more neutral name never works. When I was a kid, we said handicapped. When I was a kid, we said Negro or colored person. Because those had been changed from words of opprobrium. Now no one dares use those words. And for good reason. But I don't think terminological change is what we're looking for in the context of your talk. But I have another comment that's more substantive, which is that I can trace a very similar process in the iconography of the Last Judgment. And the Last Judgment used to include scenes in hell which showed various sinners. Some of them, like there was even the most bawdy of them, is a woman who is called an ustedelica, which is somebody who gave oral sex. And she was in hell. Other people are being tortured. Women are shown naked. They're actually shown sometimes with almost like Playboy kind of centerfolds, which dates me, I know, but so, and then what happened? In the 18th century, there were attempts to reform the iconography, and many of those pictures that had been there earlier were erased, cut out, painted over, covered with a blanket. But in some cases they remain, so we know what was there. But it's a process linked to all of a sudden more educated people say, "What the heck is going on among the plebs?"
Thank you. Well, I agree that these two processes are connected. It seems to me that obscene language, which is based on the denomination of genitalia, substituted the more early way of bad language, sramoslivia or lichoslivia, which rather dealt with religious accusations, so something that was considered a sin. So I mean that later language, sexualized language, is just later stage of the very similar processes.
Oh, I just want to say in terminology, they usually call these bad pictures nieprzystojne, they wrote in Polish. Nieprzystojne, nieprzystojne.
I'm wondering, so you mentioned Knadyuk, right? And that he felt that he had to explain, right? Why
I mentioned it, sorry.
Knadyuk.
Knadyuk, yes.
Knadyuk. And I mean, at the same time, I guess there was this kind of fascination about the Hutsus,
Yes.
right? And also the image of their free love. And I mean, I'm just wondering how these two things are going together.
Sorry, which things?
You know, the fascination with the Hutsus.
Okay.
And the notion of the free love, I don't know much about it, but I heard about it. And at the same time, they feel some kind of ashamed about manuscripts from the 18th century. So.
Okay, what kind of manuscripts?
No, but what you mentioned,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And I mean.
Yeah, thank you. Hutsuls are probably victim of ethnography because they were selected to be an example of most sexualized people in Ukraine, and a lot of strange things were written about them. I'm working with this material in my research as well, and I try to trace how this picture depended on the cultural background of ethnographers who worked with this material. So ethnographers from Austria usually depicted terrible dark picture of incest and everyday sex and rape and other stuff, whereas later ethnographers who came from Lviv witnessed completely different picture and described completely different moral norms. But anyway, I should say that Hutsus are interesting from many points of view, including studying their relations and what we call sexuality. Thank
you. All right, well, maybe we'll end the conversation there, or continue it informally. Thank you. Let's thank our speakers.